One core mechanic of many TTRPGs is a system by which you test your character's skills or abilities. Most of you are probably familiar with the D20 ability checks in Dungeons & Dragons, but whether it's the duality dice from Daggerheart, or the pool of dice you use from Vampire the Masquerade, or even a percentile dice that you can push in Call of Cthulhu, all of these games have a core mechanic by which we evaluate a player character's set of skills, or their ability to be able to accomplish tasks. Now, those of you who've been playing for a while know that in most TTRPGs, it's not as simple as big number good, low number bad. It can actually be the opposite. But if you've been behind the GM screen before, you know that setting a difficulty for any of these skill checks is one of the hardest things to do. Each system has a different way of thinking about skills philosophically, and that might mean that the statistics that are used to balance the game might make things that seem easy actually harder than they need to be, or things that seem hard more in the realm of possibility than they should be. In comparing all of these systems in my own experience, I do have a way that I understand them that I'm hoping can help other people understand them themselves, and maybe learn a little bit more about how they may want to use these ability check systems in their own games. So I'm going to lay out 3 different ways to think about this, and I'll use a game for reference that gels best with this kind of philosophy so that you can get a better idea of how to use it in your own games. The first one I'm going to talk about is one I call static skill philosophy. Okay, this is where the numbers mean a certain amount of skill, and that amount of skill is the same for every person in the world. A great example of a game that uses this philosophy effectively is Call of Cthulhu. In Call of Cthulhu, you use percentile dice to make your skill checks, and the number you're aiming to roll must be lower than the number that's ascribed to your skill. So, for example, if I get caught in a fistfight and I have a brawl skill of 50, to hit the other target or successfully brawl, I'm looking to roll below a 50 on my percentile dice to accomplish that check. The way Call of Cthulhu handles degrees of success, though, is by using ratios. They have 2 ratios: half the roll and 1/5 of the roll, to determine whether something is a regular, hard, or extreme or critical success. Statistically, this means that it's easier to crit in Call of Cthulhu, because the higher your skill is, the higher the number of 1/5 of the skill will be, and therefore the easier it is, the more options you have to roll for being able to get an extreme or hard success. Using this system of ratios to designate what is a critical or extreme success is a way that makes it easier to apply the static skill philosophy in Call of Cthulhu. There's literally mechanics for how well you can succeed, and it's based on how good you are at the skill in a ratio. A place where this philosophy doesn't apply as cleanly might be Dungeons & Dragons, where regardless of what you roll, you can't crit, on an ability check at least. And what that does is forces the DM to have to make a decision based on how familiar with the skill your character is, and what mechanically the numbers your character has as a bonus to that skill, to decide whether or not to make you roll in the first place, or how high the difficulty class of the skill check is going to be. This hints at the second philosophy we're going to talk about, which I call floating skill philosophy. Floating skill philosophy is where you use a set of variables to determine how easy a skill check should be in terms of numbers. You can use what I said about Dungeons & Dragons to see a decent example of what that would be applied like, but the best example is probably Daggerheart. Daggerheart goes so far as to not even ascribe mechanics to what you set your difficulties to. It only depends on what the GM thinks fits the narrative, and that's it. This allows you to factor in anything you want to factor in. The weather, the way that the PCs have interacted in the past, the social context of the interaction, the way that puddles form in certain different environments or biomes. It literally opens the door to everything. If you think about our earlier example of Call of Cthulhu, you could see how that would be a bad place to try to apply this philosophy, however. The skills in Call of Cthulhu are so heavily narrowly scoped so that they're literally down to what might be equivalent to a tools proficiency in D&D, whereas the skills in Daggerheart are experiences. Anything that has to do with being a thief, you could have an experience that says, I was a thief a while ago, and you could apply a bonus to anything as long as you spend the hope. But that brings me to my final philosophy, which is hybrid skill philosophy. In hybrid skill philosophy, usually there's a few specific things that you have to consider with the mechanics before you set the difficulty class for a skill. For example, in Dungeons & Dragons, you have, first of all, a relative idea of what the numbers mean by adjective in terms of how hard something is, 5 being easy, 10 being medium, and so on. You also have guides from your player's character sheets where a player character might be a certain amount strong and therefore have a higher bonus, and then also grant a proficiency for something that's a little smaller scoped, like a stealth skill or an athletics skill, where you get an even bigger bonus for a general array of things that fall into that adjective. Now, in Dungeons & Dragons, those skills are broad, but scoped in that way on purpose. It's so that something like unlocking a door or trying to pickpocket someone all fall under the sleight of hand umbrella, and usually when things coincide, you can have an easy schema to understand when to give someone a bonus or not. But that means when setting the difficulty class for a certain skill, you do have to consider 3 specific things, those being the player's modifier for that skill, the general schema you have to guide you on how easy that roll should be, and also the sort of level and general difficulty of the skill in the physics of the world. This may tend to have a barrier to entry for some people, though, because knowing when to use and break the framework is something that you kind of have to learn in practice. But anyways, that's just a theory, and you can play however you want.